often find myself saying the words, parenting is no child's play. And while that cheeky pun always tickles me, it is actually a very sincere, serious, and truthful statement because I've found that in my own experience as a parent and through the observations I've had interacting with innumerable number of parents as an educator, no matter how wise one becomes with knowledge and insight gathered from books and other resources, one is bound to make mistakes along the path of the parenting journey. When it comes to parenting, we often are conscious and awake to certain realities of a new world, a contemporary world, and facets of that modern life that assert their pressures on children and hence on parenting, and perhaps what we should do in order to better prepare our children for this world that they will also inhabit as adults. What maybe we pay less attention to is, as parents ourselves, what we sometimes consciously, sometimes unwittingly transfer onto our children. That may be generational, it may be demons that those individuals who are parents have of their own, unresolved, unaddressed. And while we are going to talk about both these aspects, I really think that it might be worth honing in on the parents' own mental makeup and what kind of profound impact that can have. We are
Right.
calling this session of talk therapy a mindful parenting paradigm. And on the one hand, I said no amount of knowledge can foolproof this. What it can certainly do is by interacting with an insightful psychologist, such as our guest today, who is not only relatively young, which I personally feel is very important when we are trying to unlearn a certain amount and relearn and recast a new ethos, but
Right.
also um, her one of her focus areas in her therapeutic practice has been specifically with a number of children, kids, and parents. So we are calling this a mindful parenting paradigm. This is talk therapy brought to you by Driveway Devi. I'm Karthik on behalf of Driveway Devi, and I'm so excited and privileged and grateful to clinical psychologist Anushka Modi, who's made the time to join us on a weekend to enumerate on this extremely important subject. So, welcome, Anushka, and many thanks.
Thank you so much for having me. I think I'm really excited to have this conversation today, and I think so many people could benefit from just listening to what we have to discuss today. So, yes, looking forward.
Wonderful. Before we dive into the murky waters of parenting, we'd love to know, in your own words, a little bit about your professional practice.
So, I'm a clinical psychologist, and I've been practicing for about 5 years now. Most of my work is with young adults, people in their 20s, 30s, helping them navigate life's up and downs, right? I've also been involved with a lot of NGOs across Delhi and NCR where we do sessions on certain important topics like good touch, bad touch. And more recently, I've also been working with parents and we discuss ideas like grit parenting, and we also help them rethink the way they're raising their kids to be more resilient and confident. That's a little bit about what I do.
Superb. Now, I had a needlessly long introduction because I got carried away in trying to set the context. So I'm not going to do that
Mm.
for my first question. Simply put, I think you might agree that the kind of influence and the
Mm.
various sub facets in which parents influence their children itself
Mm.
is a very varied thing. So, for
Yeah.
instance, there may be trauma that parents as individuals have been carrying of their own,
Mm.
but
Mm.
also there are
Mm.
manifestations that we see in parents of current societal trends also. So, for instance,
Mm.
even if there aren't any deep seated childhood traumas that a parent harbors, they might be overtly pressurizing in terms of
Mm.
expectations for marks, performance, etc. So my first
Yeah.
question is very simple: what are some chief ways or areas in which you
Mm.
have observed parents
Mm.
can negatively influence children?
Mm. So, in my experience of working with both parents and children, I see a lot of patterns that can affect a kid's mental health, often without like parents even realizing it. So that's one thing. They're doing it, but they're probably not realizing it, right? For example, sometimes it can be quite harsh or critical. They think that, if they're a certain way with their kids, they're actually motivating them to toughen up, right? But what actually happens is that the kid starts to internalize a lot of these messages. They begin to think that they're not good enough or that they constantly have to prove their worth to their parent. And over a period of time, a parent without realizing can also, because of this habit, really chip away their kids' confidence. That's one. That's a very unintentional way of doing it, right?
And just to sort of corroborate my
Mm.
layperson's understanding, this
Yeah.
can include verbal, oral, emotional abuse in that sense. Some parents also uh, in that same alibi also
Mm.
hit and discipline children. So there are
Yeah.
lots of ways in which this
Yes,
manifests.
absolutely. And in fact, Asian parents are known for this because there's also a term for it. It's called tiger parenting, where they feel that they have to set harsh standards of achievement for their kids, and that they have to consistently and constantly micromanage and discipline them. They have to evaluate them. And imagine that a kid is growing up feeling that every move of mine, every choice of mine is being evaluated, while a parent might think that that's going to nurture them into being very, very confident. It's actually quite surprising that it's going to have an opposite effect, that it's going to make them extremely doubtful of their life choices.
Absolutely. And by that same token, I want to very quickly check with you that not only does it, of course, damage being invalidated by a parent, but also it forms unhealthy associations of validation for that child. So, in any
Absolutely.
other area except the specific areas in which parents have been, let's say,
Hmm.
praising or rewarding that child,
Yeah,
they won't consider it any kind of achievement except in those very specific areas.
absolutely. And this is an example that I've used with a lot of clients of mine where we say that validation is like a compass. So you know how when people are sailing, back in the day, they had to use a compass to navigate whether they're on the right track or not. So the validation that we get from people is a compass that we use in a way to figure out whether we're on the right track or not. And so for a child in his ecosystem, who is he getting this validation from? He's getting it from his parents, right?
Absolutely. That's a wonderful way of contextualizing it. Of course, you mentioned tiger parenting. In For
Yeah.
my generation, a very often used sort of analogy when we were younger was throw him in the deep end, because that's actually what a lot of our parents literally did when
Yeah.
trying to teach us swimming. And then of
Right.
course it became this life philosophy in terms of
Mm.
learning everything, throw them in the deep end.
Yeah. No, in fact, I remember something very similar happened to me when I was learning to swim. And the coach just pushed me into the water, thinking that I'll just float and learn how to, survive. But what it actually ended up doing for me personally was that it led to a lot of trust issues in the sense that even if I used to walk across the boundary of the swimming pool, I was really fearful that someone's going to push me into it. right?
Absolutely, which is so such a tragic outcome. Of course,
Yeah.
not to mention the imminent possibility that in the first place you'll probably never venture near water again.
Yes. Yes, that's very true. So I mean, of course, what I realize is that parents are doing this unknowingly. And going back to what you asked, another thing that they do very commonly, that's very commonly seen, is of course emotional invalidation. Now that we're talking about that, right? So it's not always obvious. Sometimes it's something as basic as stop crying, it's not a big deal, or don't be so sensitive. And of course, while parents usually mean well, when this happens repeatedly, right, kids begin to feel like their emotions aren't valid, or there's something wrong with the way that they feel. Now, what's going to happen? They're going to stop sharing what's going on with them. They're going to start doubting their own feelings, right? So,
In fact, you bring up something absolutely critical. Not only do they become insular and isolated,
yeah,
they don't allow themselves often to feel those feelings because they've
yeah,
basically interpreted and concluded that they are wrong. And
yeah,
there's a very important gendered lens to this also, because
yes,
actually it is boys most often who are
yeah.
told, stop crying like a girl. I mean, it's unbelievable.
Yes, yes. There's more to that, which we'll of course talk
Yeah,
about later. But yes, a lot of times, girls are told not to get into activities that are meant for boys, and boys are told not to show emotions or cry like a girl.
yeah.
Um, so yeah, there's a lot more to discuss on that end,
Of
actually.
course, of course. I mean, I know,
Yeah.
forgive me for going off on tangents, but there are
No
certain things
worries.
and comments I can't help. It's funny. It all begins with that blue versus pink
Uh,
nursery when one finds out one is in the family way.
Absolutely, absolutely. So the best color to go with is yellow. I feel it's gender neutral and it's not conveying something. So it's
Yeah,
perfect. Yeah. So
right.
there's also something about parents having some sort of like say high expectation, right? Of course, wanting your child to do well is very natural, I feel. Um, but you also have to take into account what your child's interests and limits are. Because sometimes when you force your kid into doing something without giving them a choice on what they want to do or pursue, it can be very, very overwhelming. And as a result of that, kids can start to feel like they're only valued for their achievement. And what it ends up doing is that it ends up creating what I like to call praise junkies. Okay, these
Hmm.
are like people who are into their 20s or mid 20s, and because they've only ever been valued for their achievements, if they're not praised for something that they've done at work or in their own lives, they begin to question it, right?
I was
And
talking, I must, it's in
yeah,
context. I was talking to, we had a beautiful session with a Dr. Vaishnavi Chandran very recently, and
okay,
she's somebody who designs educational curricula and programs that essentially bridge the gap between education and industry requirements. And therefore,
okay,
she is somebody who has studied and has very, very keen insights on
mm,
generations, particularly younger generations. And
okay,
she spoke
yeah,
exactly of this. And in fact, she said that once school is over, there's a reduction in the number of contests that take place. So it goes down in
mm,
college. And then post college, pretty much it is non existent in the workspace or workplace where, apart
yeah,
from your annual appraisal and the fact that you may get a bonus, there's really no
yes,
other competitions taking place. And
yeah,
because you use that beautiful phrase, praise junkies, there's a fall
yeah,
from grace that happens in a lot of these individuals who
yeah,
don't know how to process that because their nervous system and everything is so attuned to
yeah,
constantly competing and winning or trying to win.
yeah. Also leads to a lot of perfectionism, stress, burnout. And I like to tell a lot of people like perfectionism is like trying to capture air. You know it's around, and you get caught up in the idea of trying to catch it. And every attempt that you make at it, you just fail. And then you start to doubt your own capability, right? So I think parents, in an attempt to raise confident kids unknowingly, start to also create what I like to call praise junkies, which is very, very detrimental in the long run. If anything, you have to raise a kid who can bounce back from failure. You don't have to raise a kid who doesn't know what it's like to fail. I
Yeah,
think that's something that
absolutely. But
parents
that
need
will
to
only
understand.
happen if to that child and to that individual, that particular exam or contest is not the be all and end all of life.
Exactly. Exactly. Right. And in that moment, even as a kid, it might feel like it's probably the end of it all. But I think that's something that's a perspective that you also gain much later in life. And you look back 10 years and you're like, okay, it all worked out for me somehow. Right. So I think that's something that a child will also probably learn many, many years down the line, eventually.
Uh, Speaking specifically about, of course, our country, and I know that it's terribly unfair to generalize India itself, it's almost impossible. But again, in your interactions and observations, um, are there any specific, um, uh, issues or traumas or distress that you find parents have themselves that they also
Hmm.
then tend to pass on apart from what we've just spoken about?
I think I think something that I see as a very generalized fear that parents walk into therapy with is that they come from a place of insecurity where they feel that they might not have achieved as much in their lives with also having fewer resources while they were growing up, right? So that naturally conditions them to think that, we had lesser resources, but now our child has so much more. If only we had this much, we could have turned around our life in a way that we can't even imagine. So that undue, unsaid pressure then also begins to come down into the child that, there's a lot that you can do here. Right? So that expectation of high performance, doing something with their lives
Hmm.
is definitely one of the most common things that I've seen. Like I have parents who come up to me and tell me that our child has suddenly decided not to go to college, and that's like the end of the world for them. They don't know what to do beyond, right? So it takes a lot of work and a lot of effort with the parent to make them realize that even if your child does not end up going to college, right? There is so much, especially given the digital age that we're in, right? There is so much that your child can do. Academic performance is a big thing for parents who have kids in high school, okay, deciding in between streams and thinking that if my child is not gone for the regular commerce or science, then my child is going to be an absolute failure, right? So parents are somewhat, I don't blame them because they've grown up with this
Yeah,
perspective.
because also it's a bit of a chicken and egg situation, isn't it? I remember that in
Yeah,
my school, after 10th
yeah,
odds, the
yeah,
fact that a 40 percenter could absolutely legitimately go and choose the sciences was a
yeah,
matter of scandal because there was
yeah.
this very, very well established hierarchy where it
Hmm.
was understood that the people who had done the best would get science, the second rung was commerce, and the absolute useless ones were the humanities, etc.
Humanities.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. Um, so yes, and I think it requires a lot of, like you said, unlearning for the parent to do on their part to kind of, come to terms with the idea that hey, my kid can be successful even if they choose another stream, or even better, my kid can be successful if they choose not to go to college as well, right? Um, of course, all of these problems that we're talking about do lead to a lot of family discord, right? So, family as a unit takes a hit, right? And so, to then help the parents navigate through the family disagreements, arguments, how to set a standard of, uh, what ideal behavior should be within the family. And of course, I also tell a lot of my parents who I work with that if you want to see a change in your kid, you have to be the change. So if you're telling me that your kid should not be on a on their iPad or on their iPhone post 11 o'clock, are you making that change in your own self? Because what your kid sees is that these restrictions are being put on me, right? but it's not the same for everyone else in the house. So consistency for everyone.
I mean,
So these are just some of the
it
things
has to
we,
be modeled, it has to be demonstrated, it has
yes,
to be exemplified. You won't believe it.
absolutely.
Particularly, I suppose it's a little bit more aggravated, the situation here in Jaipur and Rajasthan. Every
Hmm,
day, I'm on at least
hmm,
one phone call with the
hmm,
parent, which of course is invariably the mum,
hmm.
complaining about the child not reading. And my first and only question to her is,
Yeah,
has the child ever seen your husband or you reading? And
exactly.
then there's
Ex
silence, and that's it.
yeah. No, and moreover, are you choosing what your child needs to read? Are you giving your child a choice between what they
Yeah,
would like to read? Does it interest them? All of these things are not factored in.
yeah, yeah.
So that's something that we work on quite a bit, actually. Yeah,
I want to present a situation to you, and I'm
yeah.
presenting it because, again, it's something that I'm encountering very, very regularly. It's most disturbing, and
Hmm,
it has nuances to it. Now,
hmm.
um, you mentioned tiger parenting. Here, there's a term called helicopter moms. Um,
Yeah.
and so, again, on a weekly basis, 2 or 3 times, I get calls from mums who
Hmm,
tell me that communication skills classes karwa dijiye. Then I
hmm,
say that, okay, fine, give me a sense of who your child is, what are his or her interests.
hmm.
And invariably comes the reply, Kathak, soccer, quizzing, something, something. So
Right.
then my question is that if that child is already so fond of multiple things and is doing them reasonably well, why is it absolutely necessary that along with all of that, he should also or she should also start orating like Obama? And then there is so that so and then upon deeper investigation, and of course this has been happening to me for now a decade, there is
Hmm.
a combination of reasons why this is happening. One is, of
Okay.
course, this entire concept that you sort of, I think, alluded to, that parents want children to be excellent at everything.
Yeah.
Number one. Number two, here especially, I've found that there is a significant percentage of more than parents, particularly moms, and understand the societal and cultural context, moms who are relatively young girls, right,
Yeah.
who have, because of pressures, etc., agreed or had no choice but to get married. uh,
Yeah.
Therefore, by consequence, and this may sound a bit, funny, but it's really not meant to be. One is they really haven't lived out their own lives and fantasies and
Yeah.
desires in terms of just discovering themselves or discovering the world at large,
That's
but
so true.
instead the opposite end of the spectrum, where they've been straddled with this young being and they have
Yeah.
no idea who they are themselves. How are they expected to parent? And
Yeah.
therefore, let's just keep the child pinballing from one class to another after school hours so that there's
Yeah.
minimal interaction and time being spent at home. So it's a
Yes.
combination of these few things. And I see these kids, my god, we talk about corporate burnout and in the banking sector, etc.
Yeah.
By the time it is Friday, these young children, they're finished
Yeah.
mentally,
They are.
physically. So this
And
is,
it's not just school. It's not
yeah.
just school. It's after school tuitions, it's co-curricular activities, and then comes the restriction that you're not allowed to unwind because you can't be using a gadget.
So
And so what
that's
does
what
the
I'm
poor
saying.
kid
So
do?
they are picked up by the nanny and the driver. They are
Yeah.
shoved food in the car, made to change, and then finally get home. Oftentimes after the father has come back from office.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
my question really is that, what can be done about this in terms of,
Hmm.
should would it be a good idea to have some sessions with large parent communities to sort of try and explain certain things to them?
I think, of course, sessions at a larger community level, and also, I think something that we need to highlight over here is that a lot of the moms, all right, think that if their child is done well, right, it speaks highly of them
Then,
and all the efforts that they've put into upbringing the kid and raising them the way that they are.
right.
And similarly, they feel that if the child has failed, again, that goes to show something about their inability to raise the kid in a way where he could be more accomplished. I think moms at a larger level need to stop internalizing their child's um, accomplishments or failures for that matter. Right. I was reading this book where it said that, there was a kid who was applying to Stanford. And of course, the parent was constantly pressurizing the kid that you need to prepare perfectly for the interview and, your application must be perfect. And so he's sitting in front of the interview panel, where the panel tells him that we're not admitting you to Stanford because you're perfect. We're admitting you to Stanford because you have a contribution to make, right? And that contribution can be big or small, but it's a contribution. It's not perfectionism. And I think moms really need to start imbibing more of this in their lives, where they need to see what big or small ways can their kids contribute to different things, be it at home or at work or in school, right? And stop chasing this delusional thought of having to raise a kid who's like, say, perfect, because like I said, it's like trying to capture air. It's not going to happen. Right?
You brought up a very critical point, and really for me, it opens a Pandora's box because this is such a complex issue. एक
Yeah.
तो in first and foremost, this absolutely omnipresent guilt that the gender itself is constantly experiencing for just being a woman, and then of
Yeah.
course daughter guilt, mom guilt, partner guilt, this guilt, that guilt. And also, it ties in my understanding, to that same point about personal fulfillment, where
Yeah.
that child is seen as the only means to the end, that end being
Mm.
accomplishment, and the child
Yeah.
is the tool through which. And I think it's very symptomatic of what you said, that you are anyway making a significant contribution. But I can't tell you the number of women I've come across who say themselves, I am
Yeah.
just a housewife. And I
Yeah.
keep telling them. And that
Yeah.
really is, for me, the crux of the matter, because it is the
Yeah.
world's hardest job,
Yeah.
unpaid labor, and it
Of
can't
course. Yeah.
possibly be perceived by that person who's performing that role as just, because there's nothing just about it.
Absolutely.
So
Absolutely.
I
Yeah.
get very, very riled with this thing,
Yeah.
and I feel very strongly.
Yeah.
And I'm also, again, I would like to apologize. My conversations aren't usually this haphazard, but this is
No,
such
it's
a
okay.
complicated subject. Mm,
Yeah.
One more thing I want to touch upon specifically, Anushka, is that
Hmm.
uh, talk a little bit also, because there's such a vast difference further perpetuated by conditioning and societal stereotyping between men and women, and therefore between
Yeah.
fathers and mothers. Talk a
Yeah.
little bit about some interesting observations you've had vis-a-vis parenting through a gendered perspective.
Mm, I think firstly, I see a lot of difference in the parenting ideology between men and women. A lot of the things that a mom would possibly be concerned about are basically very irrelevant to the father, which also means that the father often ends up dismissing it, that, oh, this is nothing to be worried about,
Mhm. Can you
right? Um,
contextualize that, for instance?
like, say, for example, if I'm working with a parent who has like literally a newborn who's like, say, 6 to 7 months. Now, you will be surprised that this mom's dependency on people for support is quite high. This could be a nanny, this could be extended family, this could be like, because they need that kind of an ecosystem and support around them to be able to look after their kid. Um, and maybe for the father, this is the mom just being too hyper about everything and can possibly do away with this ecosystem and also raise the kid all by herself, right? right? So that's a very stark difference in ideology where, one of the partners feels that I need some form of support, and the other feels that, oh, between the two of us, we can manage and we don't really need. Now that is one of the things in terms of the gender differences that we're talking about. But there are also these traditional gender roles that sneak into family life without us even realizing. Okay. And this could be something as basic as, like you said, that you have women who come up to you and say, "Oh, I'm just a housewife." Now they're the ones who are doing the invisible work, right? And the fathers are the ones who are seen as doing all the heavy lifting. And you would be surprised, but kids pick up on that really
Yeah,
early.
yeah. If you hadn't brought up this crucial point,
Uh,
I would have asked you as a separate question.
yeah, yeah, right. So when we talk about gender roles in family, it's just not about who cooks or who goes to work. It's about the messages that we are sending to the children about their worth, their dreams, and what's possible for them, right? So when we have, like, say, a little girl who sees that her mom's voice about wanting to start her own thing is very easily being ignored, or her ambitions are being set aside very quietly, what she's learning, often without a word being spoken, is that this could also happen to her, right? Or when a little boy is being told to be tough and not to show emotion, he is learning to hide himself away, believing that sensitivity or vulnerability is a weakness, right? And kids are vicarious learners. They pick on every subtle thing that is happening around them. So parents are not realizing that everyday conversations are shaping their kids' mind in the way that they are beginning to think what life could look like for them moving forward. So my mom had this running joke at home where sometimes my dad, you know, like, of course, jokingly would say that I'm the head of the family. I said so. Okay. And my mom would be like, yeah, you're the head, but I'm the neck. So you move where I move, you know. So that was like a running joke at home. But it was fun to know that, that perspective was quite nice. We would all laugh about it. But that's not how most Indian households operate, I feel.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that is so critical. The modeling that
Yeah,
is unconsciously and by sheer osmosis
yeah,
inherited by a child, seeing the
yeah,
status quo at home is unbelievable.
yeah,
Both in terms of gender of the mother and father, and also the messaging that is given to the children themselves varies so
yeah.
much between it being a boy
Mm,
or a girl. um, I've written lots about this.
yeah,
I was always a disappointment to my father because I didn't play cricket. I didn't do any of those boy things. And as years went on, the most polite way he could articulate his colossal disappointment was, वो बड़ा अलग किस्म का इंसान है. So that's how
So,
it.
that's one thing. If you can't, like, put your child into like a typical traditional box, you call them different,
Yeah.
you know? And I mean, that's the thing about parents, because of the way that they've also been raised to make sense of things. They want to box you into a certain uh, type, that, okay, this is the type of child I have, right? And when they're not able to box you into either one, then they just create their own perceptions of who you are as a person, often
Most
inaccurate
Most
perceptions.
definitely. In fact, this I would say is a universal need and desire, not
Yeah,
just for parents, for everyone
yeah,
in society to neatly parcel us and put that
yeah,
label with one thing written on it. God forbid there's one more than one.
yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
we are completely out of time and we can have multiple dialogues, but I must ask you,
Yeah,
it's very easy to go on pointing out the bad.
yeah,
What are
yeah.
some, in broad strokes, what are some important facts or facets that young stroke new parents can be mindful of so that at least we can begin to correct some of the incorrectness.
I think just realizing that becoming a parent does not mean that you have it all figured out. I think that is something that new parents particularly struggle with. And in that attempt, they also bombard themselves with a lot of information on what's the right way to raise a kid. Uh, and I often see a lot of new parents fearing making mistakes with their kids,
Hmm.
right? I
Yeah.
think to all the new generation parents out there, I would like to tell them that, you're also learning, you're also on your journey of being a parent. And in that, if, you've done something, or, you were probably using a certain technique that you read about, it's now working out with your kid, or your kid is being tough. These are moments that are going to come along your parenting journey, not just now, but even later on. But that one bad moment is not going to define you as who you are as a parent, right? So they need to take it a little easy. There's so much information out there. They're trying to like absorb it all in and then really blend it together to find their parenting style.
Huh,
But
but it's being treated more like this project now, right? I mean,
yeah,
there's something inanimate about it also.
yes. Like, like, okay, now this is like tummy time, and this is this time, and that time, and my kid needs to eat this and that. And while, of course, it's all research based
Sure.
and scientifically backed, take it a little easy. It's
Hmm.
okay if, you mess up once in a while. It's also okay if the significant other messes up once in a while, because you tend to hold them liable then. You're like, oh, you did this and now this happened, right? Um, yes, and another thing I kind of want to like, because a lot of the parents these days are working, you know, they try to juggle between work, family life, and raising a kid, to which I always say that you don't have to juggle it all together, right? You have to let something take the lead for at least some time in your life and let the other things take a back seat. And that's the only way you will be able to do justice to what you're doing, right? So if you've just had a baby and the next 1 year is about maybe other things taking a back seat and you just focusing on that, then that's okay. That doesn't define you as not playing the role in other parts of your life.
That's both those points are so beautiful and so unexpected because I thought you will give some hardcore, like, psychological, because they're so, oftentimes we completely miss the simpler, more obvious
Yeah,
human things. And we get
yeah,
wrapped up in theories and all kinds.
yeah,
And I can tell you from personal experience, the first point you made about just chilling out a little bit is so important. It has nothing to
yeah,
do with age, but because by sheer coincidence,
yeah,
Anuja and I are in our 40s. We had our daughter when
yeah,
we were in our late 30s. And
yeah.
especially again in Jaipur, people who had contemporaries with Krisha were at least a decade younger than us themselves. And we
Right.
found such a stark difference where, for instance, you put the two babies in the same situation.
Yeah,
Krisha was extremely young. I think she must have been under 3 years old. And she got
yeah.
severely dehydrated. And we had to
Hmm.
rush her to a doctor's house and put IV, etc. And
Hmm.
the panic that I see in most parents in those situations where really you
Yeah,
ought to be calm, the opposite of panic, as
yeah,
opposed to
true.
generally speaking, the way my wife and I approach similar situations, there's a vast difference. And,
Yeah,
we could have also berated ourselves and been like, "Par wo, in the first place, dehydrate kaise ho gayi, how irresponsible," and, felt guilty and
yeah,
crappy about it for
yeah,
years together. But I mean, it's all this happens.
yeah, absolutely. This happens, and like, I think a lot of parents need to learn to let go of control. And they also need to realize that, okay, while you're dealing with a toddler or like a preschooler, you can still exercise a lot of this control. But at some point, your kid is going to rebel. And what are you going to do then? Right? So letting go of control and having some form of like a belief that, okay, things will fall into place. It's okay. You don't have to get every day right. Some days can be bad. And if you don't demonstrate that resilience, then how do you expect your child to be resilient? So if having a bad day and bouncing back from it is something that you have to model and demonstrate for them to be able to learn this.
I have a funny conclusion to make. I have the liberty to make it. You probably shouldn't, even if you feel that in your professional capacity. But I think we have, seem to have gone straddled two extremes where our parents had no clue what they were doing, uh, to now the new age parent, is like a project. And I think we
Yeah,
need to strike a balance between those two
yeah,
extremes, which is
yeah.
where a mindful parenting paradigm comes in, because you can't be mindless and you can't treat it like a project. So in the
That's true.
middle sounds good. For all the
Yeah.
project wala types, there should be an exam that is mandatory before they're allowed to become parents.
That's so true. I totally agree with that.
and
100%. Yeah.
and on a lighter note, it is, pun intended, the birthright of every parent to mess their children up a little bit, and then, otherwise you guys would be out of work. Come on.
Yeah.
So, anyway, thank you very much. It's been a lovely discussion, a bit all over the place, but we'd love to do a more structured follow up at some point,
Yeah, for
because
sure.
there's just so much to cover.
That's true.
Each of these subpoints themselves can form one entire interaction.
Yeah.
But thank you. Thank you for your insight, for your investment, for your interest. I wish you all the best with your work, and I'll be in touch. Thank you.
Thank you so much.